Happy Sabbath, everyone. I pray that you've had a good Sabbath. Um, Today, I'm just hoping to wrap up the thoughts that we had started last week. So there won't be too much material that we're going to cover, as it's more so bringing everything together and then coming to whatever conclusion we do come to. And that entails going through different examples of where we see radical feminism at work and where we see liberal feminism at work, either externally in the world or how God has dealt with their people internally. And um, we can then reflect on, well, kind of reflect on what our, I'll say, purpose is here at the end and come to an mutual understanding of what that purpose is and if it is the same or if it's different to how God has worked with their people in past dispensations. Um, and so I won't give a very broad recap. I'll just ask if someone could encapsulate how we understood liberal feminism and radical feminism, the two different ways in which people seek to achieve equality. So, yeah, who
Are
wants
you,
to have
talk-
a go?
are you talking about in the past before Elder Paminda gave us a new version?
Now, now, and then we're going to go into the past and understand that context. But yeah, what we spoke about last week specifically in the studies that we did, at least.
Okay, I can do maybe.
Hmm.
So, liberal feminism trying to bring equality, changes to achieve equality within the system in the same structure.
Okay.
The radical feminism trying to change the structure, change the system.
Okay. So both are seeking to achieve equality. Yes.
Yes.
So the goal is equality. And you're saying liberal feminism seeks to see how we can reform the existing structure or integrate marginalized groups into that structure, existing system.
Yes.
There's a phrase that we used, liberation through integration, that I think encapsulates it quite well. Liberation through integration. So you have the various systems in society, whether that's education, um, politics, uh, medicine, etc. And it's seeking to take marginalized groups that have lived outside of that system and finding ways in which they can be included in society. And then radical feminism, as you've described it, Magda, is let's see how these marginalized groups have been marginalized because of that system. So instead of trying to integrate marginalized groups into the system, let's envisage a new system. Let's break down this system that is inherently patriarchal at its core, at its roots, and take out those roots so that we can create a new system. So it's not liberation through integration, it's liberation through reimagination, re-envisaging, reimagining a new structure. So new systems, systemic change at all levels. So fundamentally, that's what we took those two views of how to achieve equality, and we started inspecting different dispensations of God's people, starting with Moses, and then we went to the history of the disciples in Christ, specifically Paul, and Paul's attitudes towards women in society, and Paul's attitudes towards slavery, Moses's attitudes towards slavery likewise, and God's attitudes towards God's people and salvational issues like baptism. And we saw this duality to God, where you have this salvational thing, how people have a relationship with God being turned upside down. It's radically different now. With what I'm referring to as baptism, where you go from an institution of circumcision, where your connection to God is conferred through your relationship to your husband or to your father, and now it's democratized. It's open to all, to slave free, to woman, to man, to different ethnicities, to Jew, to Gentile. However, in that same history, you have God, and I'll say through the conduit of Paul, um, instead of breaking down the institution of slavery, ethnic slavery, as well as gendered slavery, Paul says, okay, let's see how we can make your lives better within these existing systems, which is what liberal feminism aims to do. And then we went into the Protestant Reformation and saw that how the Protestants regarded the Catholic Church, as well as this unity between church and state, at first started off as wanting to reform the Catholic Church, at least with regards to certain institutions within the Catholic Church. It then morphed into creating a new religious experience. However, when you then take it to another aspect, such as the unity between church and state, they don't necessarily reform any change anything. In that Dark Ages period, the fundamental property of the beast was this unity between the kings and the papacy. And when you have this new nation rising up, America, and Protestants fleeing to the Americans from Europe, this same mindset is carried over, and it's demonstrated by what if someone could give me what that first group of people that settled in the East Coast, um they were Protestants, but a specific name slipped my mind, but whomever they were. Pardon, sorry?
I'm just guessing Puritans.
Yeah, Puritans. The Puritans in the area organized their society with this same church-state relationship. And further down the road, you have the citizens then adopting the view of John Locke and other philosophers, or should I say political commentators of the day. But that's just to say that they didn't do anything radically different with regards to this unity between church and state. And then we go into the Millerite history, and we consider in this one small aspect Ellen White, how she related to women as well as to people of color. She related to them in very different ways than what society had asked of these groups, but that didn't necessarily mean that she was offering something radically different. What I mean by that is when we think of the Emancipation Act, for example, the cornerstone to Abraham Lincoln's politics, it's taking enslaved people from being enslaved, this institution, and integrating them into all a patriarchal society. And when I use the term patriarchal, I'm encompassing any form of discrimination, and hence why years down the line you still have the need for the civil rights era, where Martin Luther King is fighting for civil rights. If that system had been changed fundamentally, there wouldn't have been the need to fight for civil rights. But because things were addressed in a way that took people from being underrepresented in the current political system of liberal democracy within America and integrating them into, you have Ellen White making comments like slavery isn't dead. You've just I'm paraphrasing, you've popped the pimple, but the root causes of slavery still exist.
Spirit.
Pardon, sorry?
The spirit lives on.
The spirit lives on, exactly. In other areas where Ellen White seeks to educate people of color, in the South at that time, she recognizes that for the truth to go forward, there still needs to be segregation of the races. And that's not a radical change because it's not addressing the root of the problem. It's looking at the context in which America is in and saying, okay, how can we make lives better for Black people in America at that time, former slaves, so that they can get the gospel. That's a liberation through integration into the existing structures or systems that be. And so we've gone through those at least 4 histories and seeing this duality between radical and liberal. And then we started looking at power and how this whole notion of where power is derived from needs to be looked at through a radical lens, because ultimately all these systems that subjugate or discriminate are rooted in power imbalances. So through your liberal feminist lens, it's let's get more women in the workplace, into CEO positions. Let's get more women politicians. And which is, we would recognize in today's society, we want that. We would want to see more women presidents. But if we're going to address the root of the problem to why it's so difficult for women to become presidents or CEOs or leaders of any type, not just women, other marginalized groups, it has to come from addressing the root of the problem. But while addressing that root of the problem, we recognize that we still need women leaders in this system. So what are we going to do? It's attacked, or it's addressed through this liberal feminist perspective. So that's where we left off. And I said that we were going to go through 2 more examples and understand the dynamic of the 2, I'll say, branches of feminism in those areas or systems or institutions, if you want to call them. One being knowledge, the other being beauty. And then we were going to go to 3 different rights that have been won by feminist activists through the years. We'll stay in the context of America and see who won those rights. Where did we get to? How did we get to where we are today? Through which working of feminism, if I should say. So, knowledge. When we consider knowledge, or when we speak about the system or the institution of knowledge, what does that mean? What does that mean to you, Magda? What comes to mind?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. If I were to say to you, or when I say the systems of knowledge in society, or the institutions of knowledge, or the processes of which knowledge exists, what do you understand by that? What comes to mind to you when you think of knowledge?
I am thinking. You can come back to me a bit later. Sorry.
Sure, that's okay. Anyone else? I can't see
I'm
the chat too well,
I'm
so
not quite sure what you're asking. Do you mean universities?
yeah. So
Education.
universities is an example, and education.
Or we could also say journalism.
Mm-hmm.
Process in the world, yeah.
So education in general, we would say universities. I like that, the last one you said, Natalie. What did you say? Again, please say it again.
Journalists, prophets of the world.
I'll just put it as journalism. That's okay. Just to keep it more generic. So general journalism. Any other thoughts or examples?
Books, but I suppose that comes under education.
Mhm.
We say books, same similar to journalism.
Yeah, so I didn't want to put education because it can be broken down further. So let's imagine that I didn't say education. So we can put books
Okay.
written by authors to convey ideas. Mhm.
Documentaries.
Yeah. Documentaries.
Social media.
Sure. Um
It must be good because they're actually the right, or let's
sure.
not say the right, the legislation's coming out trying to stop you get
Mhm.
information and knowledge from these things.
Yeah. So these would be your avenues in which knowledge is disseminated. Another one we can put down is it's tied to universities, but you have these institutions exist separate to universities sometimes, research labs um, that seek to understand societal issues, just being funded by donorship or whatever the case may be. And you see a lot of them in America with regards to conservative parties funding think groups. Yeah, if I can call them that think groups. Think tanks, that's the word, sorry. Think tanks. So we have all these different avenues in which knowledge is disseminated. When we take that and we understand us as a movement, and we were to start considering what we mean by the truth, what is it that we believe is right and wrong, what our beliefs are about society, about God, about how we should relate to each other within the movement specifically. In 1989, it's just everything that we see at each major waymark to be the truth, the knowledge that God is giving us, that increase of knowledge. So when we look at these institutions or these systems through a liberal feminist lens or perspective, it's wanting to seek equality. It says that all these places, there's inequality in all these areas of life, in your junior school, your high school, in journalism, in the literature world as a whole, in the documentaries that come out, in social media and research labs, there's inequality. And where's that inequality stemmed from or driven from? It's through lack of representation. We don't have lots of women professors. So the solution to that is let's get more women professors into university that are publishing papers, into academia, if I can put it that way. Let's get more women journalists who are able to share their perspective. And so it's looking at these institutions, how they currently exist as a whole, and saying, let's get more women into them. That's what let's get to equality in that way. How would we consider it from a radical feminist perspective now? So I've offered a simple definition of the inequality that exists with regards to knowledge, in education, in journalism, books, documentaries, all these different places that you've all articulated. And at a simple level, we say, okay, there's not a lot of representation for women within these systems. So let's integrate or liberate women through integrating them into these systems. How would a radical feminist approach these systems of knowledge?
I kind of not agreeing what I'm going to say. I've got no time to explain that, but they want to take the systems completely down and revamp them the way they should be.
Why?
They're liberal. They just want to change them. They want to destroy the system because they got to get to the root of patriarchy. But when I look into the world and I look at radical feminists, I don't see them doing that, and so I get confused why they get called radical feminists sometimes.
So you've given us, the definition that I'll say agreed to at the beginning, that it's this change of system, but why change the system? Like, the liberal feminism says that there's not enough women in these systems. So let's get women into these systems of knowledge. Why isn't that enough? So that would make sense if I'm speaking to someone and I'm saying that this university has 10 male professors, 10 out of 10 male professors. The solution to the problem is get more women professors into university. So we have 5 women professors and 5 men professors. That will solve the problem. Where does a radical feminist come from that and say, that isn't necessarily where the problem is. It's a stopgap, but it's not necessarily where the problem is. Does my question make sense? Yeah, go on.
Okay, it's kind of like so because the whole approach, the whole society, the way people see women, minorities, and that stuff, this all needs to change. So just to do little changes and put women in the power doesn't help, because the expectation and all what women has to go through and all the male-centeredness and all this stuff needs to be changed. So that's why the all roots of patriarchy, the whole system needs to be completely changed. So even though maybe radical feminists want to do it here, we see it's quite impossible to do it like here, like not impossible. We know we are doing it as our movement, and then it will carry on in heaven. But yeah, basically this all needs to change.
So if I understand what you've pointed to, Magda, it's the fact that even if you get more women in these systems, fundamentally, how these systems exist are based on patriarchal ideologies. So if you're going to think about academia, media, religious institutions like our movement, what we value as truth and who we seek to define what is truth needs to change. So if you have 5 women in academia and 5 men, all you're going to have happen is those 5 women's opinions being undervalued. And so you don't necessarily change who gets to decide what is truth. Is that kind of a reflection of what you're saying?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, this whole denying or dismissing their points or being harassed or this sense of control, and
So we need to think of how we look to who gets to be entitled to knowledge. So if you recall, we went through a chapter in the book entitled, and we explored how throughout the ages and today, there's this sense of entitlement, we'll say men have over to the dissemination of knowledge and who gets to have knowledge. And that was seen through 2 examples. Mansplaining, if we all recall what that is, and gaslighting. It's this using power. If you recall, I said power is what lays center to the problems of all these systems. Using your power to manipulate the narrative, where a woman in this case is led to question what is truth, because in society's perspective, said man who holds power is entitled to have that knowledge. And so he gets to decide what is truth. There's a little,
Curtis,
yeah, go on.
do you think that's why a lot of radical feminists go too far, where they just want to eradicate men and just be matriarchal? You know, maybe they're not seeing it clearly that that's where it's going to, because they know that having men in any of the systems, you're never going to root out patriarchy. So they go a bit too far. That's my opinion anyway.
I don't know if, again, if we just stick strict to the definitions of what radical feminism is, and instead of taking self-described radical feminists and taking their ideas and fitting that onto what radical feminism is, it would, I could say, absolve situations like that of seeing women who want a matriarchy as being radical feminists. Because when I started off by pointing out that how we think about what power is, what power is used for, how do we measure power as being the central, the cornerstone of patriarchy, then we see, as we've discussed in the past, that matriarchies can be patriarchal in their own right. And so that what you've just described is it's just patriarchy with the face on the cover. And so I don't consider those as radical feminists. If anything, they're just patriarchs as well.
Hi, Curtis.
Yes, who's that? Sorry.
That's Charity.
Yeah, go on.
Okay, I'm just going back to the question you had asked before about, I'm forgetting the exact question about radical feminists and the whole idea of why they wouldn't be content with just having women, an equal amount of women, representation within the systems. And as we have spoken about radical, the word radical itself, it speaks to the idea of uprooting, as we have said, right? And so as a radical feminist, when you look at that system, when you and I look at that system, we are going to say we are not going to have women basically. It's like when they get into that system, they don't necessarily, like was said, they're not able to represent their ideas in the proper way because they have to assimilate into that system, right? So as they assimilate into that system, they're forced to abide by the rules of what is there within those systems. And in as much as you'll have women also speaking out within that system, it's not a solution to the problem, right? To the root problem. But sooner or later, you're going to have that same system choking women or whatever they're saying. So to get rid of the system itself, because it's built upon a foundation that is unequal and a foundation that is patriarchal anyway. So sooner or later, it's going to become a problem, and it's not necessarily going to be representing that equality that is required by all humanity.
Yeah, thank you, Charity. I think you articulated that very well. And I love the phrase that you used, where when we integrate marginalized groups, women in this context, into a system that is inherently patriarchal, what ends up happening down the road is that those same people are forced to abide by the rules of that said system. So where they may break that glass ceiling initially, last week we spoke about how women who come into power are then forced to then take on coded, I say coded, stereotypical masculine traits in order to abide by said rules, because that's what the rules are. Behave like a man in the workplace and you'll get ahead. And what ends up happening time and time again, and as we know in studies that show that women who behave aggressively in the workplace are punished, where men who behave aggressively are not. So by assimilating more CEOs into a patriarchal system that asks you to be aggressive to get ahead, you end up being punished by that same system that you've integrated into. And so the same can be said about the different areas of knowledge that we have within society.
Good.
Yep.
Could I say something as well?
Yeah.
As you were speaking, I guess I'm going to repeat much of what you said. Maybe there might be a few things I add to it. But when you asked what is wrong with the institutions that exist as it relates to knowledge, the first thing that came into my mind was, is it Luther's quote that the universities are the gates of hell? Yeah, but anyway, it's in the great controversy. So that was the first thing that came into my mind. I think you said, like, how would a radical feminist approach the problem? And I was like, see the universities as the gates of hell. But anyway, what I mean by that is when you look at these sources of knowledge, sources of human knowledge, they seem to have a common characteristic shared between them, and that is knowledge is an esoteric phenomenon. So by that I mean it's for the specially initiated alone. There's an elite group of people that have access to and also originate knowledge. That's how I think the systems of knowledge work in our world. An example in the Bible that came to my mind actually is Daniel chapter 2. If you look at Daniel chapter 2, you had 4 classes of people, the magicians and the astrologers and sorcerers and something. But you know the people I'm talking about, right? And in that chapter, what I found interesting is Nebuchadnezzar realized that he was being hoodwinked. He was being duped by them. And why he felt he was being duped is because they said a statement and said, what you're asking for, king, is something that doesn't belong to human beings. It belongs to the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. It's in the realm of the gods. And Nebuchadnezzar was furious because these groups of people, the system that they had in Babylon, they claimed to be basically the repositories of knowledge. They claimed to have knowledge. And when they came to Nebuchadnezzar and were forced to admit that they don't have it, he was angry. So I'm just saying that's an ancient example, but the principle has remained the same, which is a small elite group of people, they're esoteric. It's specially initiated people that have access to knowledge. So it doesn't necessarily have to be gendered in the sense that it doesn't necessarily have to be a man who does it, but the system itself works like that. So I understand generally men are the ones that benefit from it. Men are the ones that run it because more broadly speaking, they are part of these systems are part of a patriarchal society or system. So definitely men would thrive in them. But generally you've got this system that has classified or categorized people. So there's people that can have knowledge and those that don't have knowledge. And there's smaller constructs that exist that have sort of like reinforced that. So I think I was reading Gino Rippon's book, I've forgotten, but I think it's Gino Rippon's book that made me start reconsidering this concept of intelligence quotient, IQ. And I'm not suggesting that there isn't differences in terms of intellectual capacity. That's not really what I'm questioning. But that you notice that this concept of IQ has been used a lot to basically teach people from the beginning, from the get-go, that, there's people that are clever and there's people that are not clever. And most probably you're among those people that are not clever. You've got the Elon Musks and then you've got everyone else. And what that has done is it has already conditioned people to listen to some people and not listen to other people. So it seems like that esoteric system, that esoteric view of knowledge is something that needs to be dealt with. It needs to be pointed out. It needs to be identified. It needs to be dealt with, because if we continue to live in a world that teaches us that there's only a few select special groups of people that have the capacity and the access to knowledge, then no matter how many women we put into centers of knowledge, the problem will remain, I think. Yeah.
Will stay the same. And that dovetails into further examples that demonstrate straight this problem. If we take this expanded definition of patriarchy as being any system that we can think of where authority is based on an ascribed status and not necessarily on merit or qualifications. What do I mean by ascribed status? It's something that I've described in past studies, but ascribed status it's the social status of a person that's assigned at birth or assumed involuntarily in life, and it offers them certain rights and privileges to the rest of society. So it's an example of what we can think of is the divine right of kings or kingship. So when a child is born, a prince, they have an ascribed status where they are already set apart in this hierarchy in society, through no demonstrated expertise or rational justification. It's just theirs. And this is much of what the kingship in Europe was based on. It was based on this divine right of kings, where monarchs claim their authority as being God-given. So you have your kings being the repositories of God here on earth, the representatives. And then you have someone stand up, John Locke, who is infamous for refuting this principle or this ideology, and he argues in a strong fashion that governance should rest on the consent of the government, governed, etc., etc., wanting to shift away from divine entitlement to a system based on collective agreement and merit. So you go from divine entitlement to collective agreement and merit. A similar notion is in papal infallibility. Papal infallibility is this dogma within the Catholic Church, which states that the Pope, being the representative of Christ here on earth, like what Peter was when Jesus ascended, when he speaks what's called ex cathedra, what that is essentially the full authority of the papal office of the papal church. When he speaks ex cathedra, he is preserved from any possibility of error on doctrinal issues that he speaks on. So he already has this unattainable level of authority on what is truth, because of this divine right conferred to him by God. Does that make sense? So you have this person who has the divine right to be the repository of truth, or in the examples that I gave, the divine right to rule. And the radical feminist critique of this is that you don't have that inherent right to define what is truth. You don't have that inherent right to wield authority or to wield power. Why I brought these two things up is because these examples mirror broader issues within knowledge systems as a whole, where truth is accepted based on said speaker's authority, which reflects the different power dynamics that we see between gender, race, class, rather than what we would consider to be logic or the true validity of what information is. So when radical feminism challenges these patriarchal structures in society, your universities, your journalism, social media, whatever avenue where truth can be defined, it advocates for this critical assessment of how truth is established and validated in the first place. So we get to reevaluate how knowledge is generated, how it's recognized, and how we determine, okay, this really is true before taking it as gospel, if we can say it that way. In summary, so the argument is that knowledge or truth shouldn't be accepted merely because it's asserted by a figure of authority. And historically, these figures of authority have been kings, have been men, have been white people, have been able-bodied people, have been people of a certain age. Hence, the when we read through the New Testament, the criteria to be an elder in the church, there was the criteria, you had to fit a certain criteria because nobody would accept what you say as truth to be truth if you didn't fit that criteria in the first place. And so this shift from authority-based to, I'll say, evidence-based acceptance of truth is that call from radical feminism if we are going to really address at a fundamental core these patriarchal institutions in the world of knowledge. I'll give a secular example, and then we can bring it back home a bit. When we think of that period within the Dark Ages, and when I don't know what to call it, I'll say scientific revolution was taking place, and why it was so pivotal in history. We had people like Isaac Newton and Galileo who approached the church and what were then accepted truths held by the papal church's doctrines, and they insisted that the church for so long has said this is truth because we are the church, because we have this divine right to say what is truth, i.e., that the sun revolves around the earth, in the case of Galileo, or Isaac Newton, how gravity works. And they stand up and they say, let's use an evidence-based approach. Let's prove out, or let's start at the root of what these things are, and let's work through the knowledge to understand what is truth. And this movement wasn't just about new scientific discoveries in their case, it was this greater push against this authoritarian grip on knowledge. Who gets to be that repository of knowledge? How do you get to be in that repository of knowledge? Is there such a thing as a siloed, sectioned off repository of knowledge? So it's not radical feminism as a whole. It's not merely seeking to adjust who gets to speak within these existing frameworks, because that's the drive of liberal feminism. It's adjusting who gets to exist or speak or stand on platforms within existing frameworks, but it's fundamentally transforming these frameworks within themselves, so that by challenging norms, by challenging power dynamics, and this idea of divine right. And it doesn't necessarily limit itself to divine right by being God ordained, but you see it within evolution as well. as when you consider the Darwinian model of evolution and you come to the conclusion of where we are today, it's just termed differently as survival of the fittest. Men own the repositories of knowledge, or whichever other group own the repositories of knowledge, because they have adapted and have the right to in today's society. So I said I wanted to bring that to us and think about how we think where knowledge is. If I were to ask you the question to start off this discussion, in your mind, what is the work of the second angel in the Great Controversy, in the lines of 1989 to the Second Advent? What work does the second angel fulfill in your minds?
Empowers the third angel and calls Babylon out. Babylon has fallen, and goes on to give the loud cry, the third angel.
So I want to use that term empowers. So there's this aspect of empowering the third angel, and I won't limit it to the third angel. I'll tie it to the first angel as well, because of the combinations of the message in 2001 and etc. But it's not limited to the third. So we see this empowerment taking place. But what does that mean to empower those angels?
To give it power so it has an effect that it's meant to have.
What power?
Can I give an example? Unless Natalie wants to answer, of course.
You go.
So the example I'll give is in the Millerite history, where the angels were first fulfilled. William Miller studies the Bible and comes to the conclusion that Christ is coming in about 25 years, I think, from 1880, which should be around 1843. And the conclusions he came to, the messages that he presented, they galvanized the movement, primarily within the United States. People were moved to action. Ellen White explains that a lot of people that had lost faith in the church started going back to church. So definitely there was an effect. William Miller's message had an effect on people, but there came a point where it could no longer have an effect on people. And I think this is me thinking now that the issue was Miller's message. While there was a lot of evidence to back most of what he was saying, it was driven by fear. Like, people were driven by fear, is what I'm trying to say. That was really the motivating, force in, listening to what Miller was saying. But when you get to the end of that period where they were believing that Christ was going to come, which is around March, April of 1844, you could no longer say what Miller was saying. So now there was a bit of disorientation. There were questions, people didn't understand, was Christ coming or not? And then you have Samuel Snow coming back and say, hold on, let's review what Miller was saying. Let's more critically analyze the things that he was saying. Some of the things that he said they're not factually accurate. Like, they need refinement, basically. And that refinement led to the seventh month movement and understanding that, you have to consider the feasts of the ancient time. And these point to October 22, 1844, the Day of Atonement. He brings out the truth on the sanctuary, even though he didn't take it to its logical conclusion. But there was a lot of refinement of what Miller had originally said. So instead of just saying, people should listen to Miller and be driven out of fear, people now had to stop and think, they had to critically analyze, they needed to review, they needed to refine. And by doing that, basically what Miller had been saying, which is the judgment is coming, was given force again. It was given power. So that's my example of how the second angel gives power to another message, whether the first message or the third message.
Thanks. And that fits well into what we were addressing initially, is that this second angel comes and says, okay, God has just told you what in the first angel's message in this time period. God's just told you, this is the message, believe me, or you're going to die. And that's fear driven. It's coded into the words, fear God and give glory, because judgment is coming. And then the second angel, as you've put it, is here saying, okay, now that I've got your attention, let's examine why judgment is coming. Let's provide substantial evidence to that claim. And in the words of the second angel, it's Babylon is fallen, is fallen. It's that great city. Why has it fallen? Because of XYZ, it's made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And in encoding the second angel in those words, we can see that now this second angel is giving evidence to that claim that was made at first, that this is what I want you to believe, you Millerites, that judgment is coming. The evidence that judgment is coming is that Babylon is fallen. And why has it fallen? Further evidence to substantiate this claim that's originally been made is because Babylon has done these sins. So now you have to believe me. And in that example, we see it demonstrated with the messages of William Miller and then followed by Samuel Snow. So the second angel is fundamentally there to empower, as Natalie said, and this power is brought through evidence. It's no longer sufficient enough because God said so. So not even God has that authority to say, because I said so, do. God holds themselves accountable to say, I said so. Here's the evidence of why I'm saying so. So let's address the problem at its roots, if I can put it that way. And that's where power is derived from. It's no longer this divine right that even God doesn't hold. Yeah, someone want to say something?
Yes, it's me. Okay. As you were talking, I also thought about something that the second angel has this thing that it does, like the other power, the empowerment rather, that I also see within the people who are part of that movement, is that basically the second angel is this effect of having people slow down and actually take time to consider what the first angel has said or what the third angel has said. Because, like was mentioned, with the first angel, the same with the third as well, the message is given with so much fear, and a lot of people are really making decisions out of the fearfulness of that message that has been given. And the second angel really helps us to slow down and let it sink in, like, as opposed to just acting out of fear, out of this, yeah, I guess fear. You now begin to assimilate that message and understand it better, and like I said, slow down, and it begins to do that work within the person, that, yeah, a different kind of work. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
Sure. I like how you termed it, it forces people to slow down, because in my mind it ties it to this the dual aspect of our being, and how God addresses that duality of our being. We know that if we can say, the fast brain is heavily driven by intuitions, by emotions, and God plays into that with the first angel. And in the second angel, God plays into that part of our nature as well by, as you said, forcing us to slow down and use our slow brain, if you want to call it that.
That's
Yeah.
Can I disagree a little bit by saying at 9:11, the second angel says, "Stop sinning," and this message is life or death. So there's and be righteous. So I think there's still fear.
As we recognize, the first angel carries on. So it's, if we go back to the Millerite history, it doesn't stop when the second angel arrives. And we can go into a study of the angels and break them down, but it's, if we just silo them, that's a good way of looking at them.
That is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think there is evidence with all the angels, like
Yeah,
all
I
three
agree.
messages. Just like there is fear with all three messages.
Mm-hmm.
But I think also there's a point that we can make or emphasize depending on what our story is.
Mhm.
So if you look at the first angel's message, there's definitely a fear element there that is not connected to knowledge.
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is, when Miller said Jesus was coming in 1843 or 4, that was not factually accurate. That was not correct. And God worked with that. God allowed it, essentially. God allowed it in order to start the movement. Because I believe in every reform line, fear is definitely used, particularly at the beginning of the work, because fear starts the work, if I can say it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is the message is not very clear at the beginning. And it in some respects, it taps into the prejudices of the people. So John, for example, said the Messiah is coming and is going to destroy, chop down the tree and then burn the chaff with unquenchable fire. And to John, that meant, you've got a king that's coming to essentially purify the Jewish nation and then overthrow the Romans. And God let that happen, and people joined the movement, with anticipation of something that was not going to happen. Just like Miller said, Jesus is coming in 1843, and God let that happen. And people actually rallied around that message and around the work in anticipation of something that God knew from the beginning wasn't going to happen. So there's definitely a fear element there that's not connected to knowledge, I think, is the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah.
And when you get to the time when the second angel comes in, the second angel says, we need to go back and we need to start reevaluating some of the things that were said in the first angel's message, because some of those things were not technically correct. The main theme of the message is correct. The time is fulfilled for sure, if it's John's time or the judgment is coming. All that is not brought into question, but you need to start understanding that this judgment is not second advent, something else, right? So Samuel Snow, of course, didn't say that. He should have said it, but he didn't say that. That it's actually something else. It's the second advent. But had the Millerite movement been a movement of success, he would have said that. And similarly, Christ comes and says, yes, the time is fulfilled, but we're not overthrowing the Romans. We're not even destroying other Jews. That's not what we're doing here. Right? We're overthrowing error, incorrect doctrines, etc., etc. Right? And in that sense, you don't actually have a fear that's not based on knowledge. So whilst in the second angel's message, you do have fear, but your fear is now backed up by much more evidence, which I think is where your point comes in, that there's a whole lot more evidence that comes in to say, don't just believe, if I could say blindly, don't just take things blindly. You need to understand how much more serious this message is, So it's not that the second angel says, it's okay, don't worry, there's no danger, but that actually the danger that you're worried about isn't the correct danger. The danger you should really be worried about is this one, if you get what I'm saying. So I don't think any of us are saying like fear is gone totally. Sometimes we can use those terms loosely, but I think we're very specific. There's a specific fear that goes, there's one that remains. There's evidence that is there with the first angel, but some of it is not evidence-based, and that needs to be dealt with. So, yeah. That's it.
And I think that's demonstrable in the fact that we find all three messages encased in the first message anyway. Fear God, give God glory, for the hour of God's judgment is coming. And those three propositions are in essence those three messages, but there's this escalation, or we'll say breaking down, as we see them as specific elements contained within the second, within the third, and etc.
Can I comment on that? Because that's really important. What you just said, the second angel that comes, Revelation 18 at the Sunday Law, Ellen White says that that second angel combines all three messages, and that is the message that goes to the world. So it's not the third angel giving the message, even though it is the third angel's message. It is the second angel combining the first, second, and third angel giving the message to the world.
empowering that message. So with all that in mind, I want to take you to I'll say another cornerstone verse of our movement and what's built our movement in Daniel 12 verse 10. And we won't read it, but we see in that verse that God has said that, I'm going to paraphrase probably poorly, that my people are meant to be the wise in that understand. And the reason that they are wise is because they understand. And so if we ask collectively as a movement and who we are there certain segments of that movement, of this movement, that are more wise? Are there certain segments that understand more? Or is it a proclamation by God that's equalized all the participants in that movement and saying, you are wise because you understand me? That's a rhetorical question, because I'm going to suggest it's this equalizing factor that God proposes for their participants in the work that they're doing. They're saying that if we silo it to a movement, a body of believers, we can extend that to society wider, but let's look at it within a religious context. It's God saying that you are all wise because you all understand what the message is. So I say that to combine what the role of that second angel and what this call is that's being made in Daniel 12 verse 10, to say that when we consider how we relate to what our message is, and we put our radical feminist hats on, it's radical feminism when it seeks to address things at its core, to understand the root of the problem. It forces you to be a participant in constructing what we believe as a movement. And so many times I've shown this progressive nature of knowledge, of truth, and I've said that it goes from acquisition to formation, and it's this segment here that I want to double down on, just by taking those principles that we've just discussed of what the role of the second angel is, and how all of us, being the wise, work in tandem with that second angel. And it's our duty, our obligation as radical feminists to be part of that building process of what knowledge is. So what is truth? When we say as a movement, what do we believe? How do we define what truth is? I'm suggesting by definition, if we're going to consider ourselves a radical feminist movement, there can't be two classes of citizens. Ones that have authority to define the thing, and then the second. I'm suggesting that we all have to be part of that process in some shape or form. Does that make sense? Do you agree or disagree?
Disagree.
Yeah, why?
Maybe I'm not understanding you correctly, but you can't say that, say, Elder Tess was the same as me. She was the thought leader, so you can't mesh us together and say we're the same, even though let's just assume I'm wise. So God can use me as well, or use you, Curtis, the same way as he uses Elder Tess. He actually chooses individuals. So I don't think we can say they're both the same, a member and an angel, thought leader.
I hear you. I hear your point. I'm looking at it from the perspective of we have thought leaders, and I agree completely that God chooses these people to, I'll say, point the movement in a certain direction. But once that job is done and we get to understanding the nitty-gritties of what that message means, that thought leader in playing a role, if we take the parable of the wheat and tares, in playing a role as being one of the reapers, that third angel, they also play a role in being part of the field. And so if they are part of that field, that puts them at an equal level to everyone else, being said wise, being the wise. So if they are, and while they are at that level, are building on knowledge, as does the second angel, what is the duty of us who are part of that field as well?
I was just going to say, you can't turn that round in the sense you're saying Elder Tess is in the field. She's also a servant looking on, and she can see the wheat and the tares, but she's also on the field as well. But you can't do that the other way around. You can't say that the plants are the servants, because the servants are the angels. So you can't say that the plants are the servant.
Why not? When we compare and contrast and juxtapose, do we not do that?
You can't do that with Matthew 13, because they all have different jobs.
No, we do that all the time. The second angel has an experience, so we all do have an experience. And the third working, so they're looking and then reaping. And we are both the participants and the observers. Participants are the ones who has the experience, that's the second angel. And observers is the third angel. So we do that all the time this way. So we are both.
Thank you, Magda, for
I agree with you, but the servants are the ones that can see the wheat and the tares, where the plants cannot. So,
but we are both. So
they both have an experience, yeah. But you can't say that they're the same, even though they have the same experience. You can tweak the servant, because the angels have a different added experience, because they can see when they're ready.
But we should be able to see as well. We do the work as well. And the work as well causing us the experience. That's eating of the little book. So we are...
They have a specific work, don't they? Because they're the angels. Without the angels, we'd be all like, what would we be doing? We wouldn't have a message. God gives the message to an angel, a prophet, Elder Tess.
So, okay, carry on.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on this, because this is something I've been, I guess, silently observing for a long time, for a long time, actually, in this movement. And that is how we understand the three angels of Revelation 14. And I guess, how I've understood it in the past, still understand it today, is that, in agreement with rule number 10, symbols have more than one meaning depending on the context in which you're speaking. So when there's quotations In fact, Ellen White doesn't even make the application that we make mainly, except maybe for William Miller. But when we associate these angels with people, that's something that we as a movement have done, I think, more than Adventists in the past. But when you look at Ellen White, you could read quote after quote where she applies the first angel, second angel, and third angel to the work that Adventism does. First angel to the work of the Millerites, second angel again to the work of the Millerites, and third angel to the work of Adventists after the Millerite movement, like after 1844. So depending on the context in which you're speaking, I think is how we define symbols or terms. If we are speaking about individuals and the angels as individuals, there's a context to that. If we're speaking about the angels as representing the work the movement does as a corporate body, there's also a context to that. So why I thought to just say it now is because it seems like, you know, sometimes we end up either sticking to one definition or another when really it's not two definitions that are in conflict with one another, like one is wrong and the other is right, but rather each have their specific context, you know. And I think also it wouldn't be correct for us to limit the first, second, and third angels only to individuals, like to people. That is Elder Jeff, Elder Aminda, and Elder Tess, because Ellen White doesn't do that. There's a context for that, for sure, but I don't think it's the only definition of the angel. So that's what I wanted to say.
So okay, I was trying to understand what your point is, and if I can put it in my words, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that we have, through all the studies we do, we have symbols in the Bible, and how we understand those symbols can be understood in different contexts, like what you said. So an example of that is locusts, where locusts are defined and understood in a certain way in one context. They can be understood and defined in another way in a different context. And so what you've done is the same thing with the angels of Revelation 14. And by mixing those contexts, we end up tripping up. And so discussions like this, where we overlap that symbol and switch them between contexts, that's what ends up tripping. That's how we end up getting tripped up. Do I understand what you said?
Okay, yeah, what I was just saying is we end up arguing amongst ourselves when we don't need to, because we just need to be very clear on in what context does the angel represent the individual and in what context does it represent the movement. Like, for example, you know, the idea that we are observers and we are also participants. That's definitely not an individual experience. That's a corporate one. So we would have to be united in our understanding of the application at a corporate level. If we're going to talk about defining a message, we normally associate that with a thought leader or a particular individual, you know. So there's a context for that. So I was just bringing it out now because I felt I don't think it's necessary for us to argue because we just need to know in which context we are speaking so that we, have a...
Yeah, got you.
Don't get confused or tripped up,
Sure. I guess what my core point, why I was leading up to this, is by going through how we view knowledge as institutions. What has happened in religious bodies historically, and the Catholic Church is one example of that. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is another example of that, is that there's departmentalized areas within those institutions who define what knowledge is because it's their divine right to do so. In the same fashion that you had the divine right of kings to shape society, to define what was truth in their societies. And I'm trying to understand if we should be modeled differently or the same to them? And if we are to be modeled differently, what does that look like if we are modeled differently to these various institutions that we've spoken about that have this divine right to say this is truth without input from the larger part of that society? Maybe it's an unanswered question, but it's trying to get us to question that in and of itself. What part do we, as everyone within this movement, play in understanding what is truth? Yeah. So we are at 5 minutes to 8, and we didn't get the chance to get to the beauty industry and seeing how what I wanted to go through in that area was seeing how it's connected to neoliberalism and capitalism, and the thoughts of taking the reins of the horse by yourself, and seeing why liberal feminism has flourished so much in the last 3 decades since the rise of what are called Reaganomics, or in the UK, Thatcherism, if we can put it that. So we didn't come to a conclusion, but we will get there next week. My today's study, at least, my suggestion is that if we're going to start critiquing the structures of knowledge in society, at a fundamental level, i.e., who holds that knowledge, whose thoughts and opinions are valid, who's yet to be given a voice, we need to address the power dynamics in those systems. And in the same thing that we do externally, we have to do internally. And the reason why we have to do internally is because ultimately we're building a kingdom that composes of, in quotes, political issues as well as religious issues. So I'll say it's counterintuitive, but we're molding church and state together, building this kingdom. So we have to think of these issues not separately, but as the same. Likewise, pointed out that we can look to universities and look at them as parables. We too can look at how knowledge is disseminated, or arrived to in these other institutions as parables for ourselves as well. Okay, yeah, Natalie.
Got what you said at the beginning of that, but I don't know whether the movement's looking to, even though I did say Daniel 2 is radical feminism, the stone knocking down, but I don't think the movement, in my opinion, that is going to change the system outside there in the world. So we can compare that internally. It is just 144,000, I think, practicing radical feminism, and the world seeing that, because nothing will change in the world.
Sure. Sorry, where did you get the idea that I don't think if I did, I'm sorry, I don't think I intimated that our duty is to change those systems in the world.
I think you said something along those lines. I can't remember now.
It was more so about envisaging what those systems should look like, because we're building a kingdom. And if we're building a kingdom and we have systems of knowledge of what is beautiful, then we have to critique. It's like this operation of comparing and contrasting with what already exists, so we can see what equality shouldn't look like, if that makes sense.
I think you were talking about power and the systems within that, and how we would change that. And I was saying we're not going to change that. We're radical feminists within the movement. Like they will see the compare and contrast, because the world won't change.
Sure. Yeah. that quote is related to what? Sorry, Blessing?
Yeah, so that quote is just one of the examples in Inspiration where Ellen White defines the three angels as the people
Ah, okay.
who are basically in God's church. Yeah. She says the three angels of Revelation 14 represent the people who accept the light of God's messages and teach the messages.
Okay. So, yeah.
So yeah, so I was just saying, connected to the questions that you're having about how knowledge is to be not only disseminated but developed in the movement, I'm not saying I have the answer, but that there's definitely merit in questioning and considering the place of everyone who is part of the movement in the development of the message. Yeah.
Yep. I wanted to end on considering just in our discussions, and how we think about what truth is, and when we have I don't know, call it debates. I don't mean that in a derogatory way. Debates about what the answer is to something. If we go back to where we started and understanding this, if I can say, a radical feminist calls for an evidence-based approach to finding what truth is, because it seeks to understand the root of the truth. And if you go to the root of the truth, it just means building from logic to logic. That's what radical feminism is when you take it to knowledge. It's taking that in when we relate to people. Equality means that when we relate to people in those disagreements, is that we're able and willing to give that evidence and that proof and etc. And it's no longer it's unequal, it's patriarchal to say a statement or something as fact without providing that secondary evidence for that claim. And this just goes back to how we relate to the first angel and the job of the first and the second angel and etc. That's not calling the first angel patriarchy, obviously, but it's just thinking about the discourses that we do have. And I just found it interesting of looking at knowledge in this way. So as I said, we'll close for today, and this discussion can go on further and further and further. But the question was, the reason why I wanted to start looking at this, because the question was leveled, are we a radical feminist movement? What makes us a radical feminist movement if we are? And as we examine the different systems or processes or institutions that are part of, that make up the movement, this is one area that I thought we could start looking at to determine whether we are in fact a radical feminist movement. And if we are or are not, what does that look like? Not only here on earth, but what does that look like in God's greater kingdom, in God's greater plan of salvation in heaven, in the new earth, and etc. Yeah, so those are my thoughts, and we'll go on to the beauty industry. If you could rewatch Alda Tessa's presentations on liberal and radical feminism, I think she mentions liberal feminism in the second presentation, so you might just need to rewatch that. The reason I want that is because at the beginning, someone asked, I can't remember who, do you want the old definition or the new definition? And I want us to see how there isn't really an old definition or a new definition or Alda Tessa's definition. They're the same thing, just elaborating different points. So we can discuss that next week.
I think it's actually Alda Parminder's progressed what it means, radical feminist, since Alda Tess. We
So
did that
yeah,
a few videos ago.
sure. We can have that discussion next week. Let's look at how Alda Tess defined it, and then take how Alda Parminder defined it, and see if there is this progression or not. We can hash that out as we work together to define what the truth is. So let's close with a word of prayer. Dear God, thank you for the opportunity that you've given each and every one of us to consider our place in this movement. We may not have come to a conclusion today, but we've started asking the question, and if the principles of radical feminism are to be upheld by you, that should be okay. As we try to understand what is truth in your kingdom. I thank you for everyone's participation. Thank you for the Sabbath. It hasn't ended yet, but as this is our last meeting together, I'm grateful for it. And I pray that each and every one of us may have a blessed week coming ahead, and that we may continue to examine the different institutions in society that are systemically patriarchal, so that we can picture what we can do in this new kingdom that we're envisaging, that we're building, really. I pray that the Holy Spirit may accompany us in all of that, and that we may be humble in that process as we question you, as we interrogate you and how you've dealt with people in the past. And I pray that we may remember that we are humbly at your feet doing that work. This is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Curtis. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.